The house church myth and why the idea of the organic early church is a modern invention. Picture the early church. If you spent any time in modern evangelical circles, the image that maybe comes to mind is some sort of romantic, intimate, and decidedly organic gathering. We imagine a small group of believers gathered in a cozy living room, sitting in a circle, and someone strums a lyre or a guitar. Prayers are spontaneous, everyone shares equally as the Spirit leads. There's no clergy, there's no liturgy, and certainly no religious structure. According to some, this was the pure church of the apostles, simple and relational before it was corrupted by institutionalism, hierarchy, and the eventual rise of Constantinian Christianity. This narrative has fueled the Restorationist and simple church, house church movements for decades. It suggests that if we want to be truly biblical, we have to strip away the pagan traditions of buildings and liturgies and get back to the living room. The only problem with this picture is that it is a historical myth. While early Christians eventually met in homes due to intense persecution, the theological concept of the house church as some unstructured, non hierarchical, spontaneous gathering is a modern invention projected backwards onto history. The reality is that the early church and early Christianity was liturgical, it was structured, and it was born out of the synagogue, not some guy's living room. The modern house church movement relies heavily on the idea that the institutional church is a corruption. Proponents like Frank Viola and George Barna in their influential book Pagan Christianity, and even in Viola's other works like Insurgents, he argues that the practices such as church buildings and sermons and professional clergy are unbiblical accretions that stifle the organic life of the body. Robert Banks, in Paul's Idea of Community, similarly argues for a purely relational ecclesiology. The scriptural defense for this view often rests on selective citations. We read in Acts 2:46, for example, that believers were breaking bread in their homes. And we see references to the church in the house of Nympha in Colossians, or we see references to these types of things in places like Philemon. The logic follows that if the apostles met in homes, well, then the home must be the ideal spiritual environment. Therefore, the move to dedicated buildings and ordered worship was a spiritual decline and a slide into religion rather than relationship. However, to claim the early church rejected structure is to ignore the first at least 40 years of Christian history. Christianity did not begin as a rejection of Jewish structure, it began as its fulfillment. In his book, The Religion of the Apostles, Father Stephen DeYoung notes that the apostles did not view themselves as founding a new religion. They were faithful Jews who believed that the Messiah had come. Consequently, they continued to worship the God of Israel in the manner he had prescribed, through the liturgical life of Israel. It's funny that when modern readers cite Acts 2:46 to support house churches, they often miss the first half of the verse, that every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. The earliest Christians maintained a dual life. They attended the synagogue for the reading of scripture and the liturgy of the word, and the temple for the daily hours of prayer. In fact, Acts 3:1 explicitly shows Peter and John going up to the temple at the time of prayer. They weren't abandoning the institution, they were inhabiting it as its true heirs. Paul's missionary strategy confirms this. In Acts 13, 14, and 17, we see that upon entering a new city, Paul did not immediately rent someone's living room and invite people over for dinner and a Bible study. He went straight to the synagogue. The structure of the synagogue, with its readings and presidents and prayers, was the cradle of the Christian faith. So, if the apostles were so committed to the synagogue and the temple, why did they end up in homes? Well, it wasn't a theological preference for cozy gatherings, I can tell you that much. It was a matter of survival. You see, two major events forced the church out of the public square. The Jewish revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70 was the first one. The physical center of Jewish worship was completely obliterated by Rome. And the second is the Birkat ha-Minim, and I'm sure that I butchered that pronunciation. But in the late first century, there was a blessing, which actually was a curse, that was added to the synagogue liturgy that targeted heretics and schismatics, specifically Nazarenes. This effectively excommunicated Christians from Jewish life. Simultaneously, Christianity was declared religio illicita, an illegal religion, by the Roman Empire, meaning meeting in public meant risking death. And so the move to private homes was a defensive necessity driven by persecution, not an ecclesiological ideal driven by a desire for intimacy. Even when forced into homes, the early Christians did not adopt the organic style of worship that's often promoted today. They didn't sit in circles and share their feelings. They renovated their homes to mimic synagogues and looked very much like churches today. We have archaeological proof of this in places like the Dura Europos church that's dated to circa AD 230 or so in Syria. It's the oldest identified Christian house church. And it was located in a private residence, yes, but it wasn't just somebody's living room. The believers had knocked down walls inside the building to create a large rectangular assembly hall, or a nave. On the eastern wall, they built a raised platform for the leader, the bishop, to stand and preside, and it created this clear separation between clergy and laity. And in a separate room, they even installed a full baptistry framed by columns featuring images of the Good Shepherd. Inscription found in early prayer halls, such as the Megiddo Church from around the same time, include dedications like that to a woman named Akeptus, who offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial. So they even had holy tables, not just dining tables. Liturgical scholars have pointed out that the term house church is also misleading to modern ears. A better analogy might be the modern storefront church or strip mall church. A storefront church isn't just a UPS store that turns into a church on Sunday. It is a space that is leased out and renovated exclusively for worship. And in the case of these early house churches, they were permanent renovations, making the space sacred and set apart, which torpedoes the idea that the early church was merely a casual meeting of friends around a dinner table. Perhaps the deepest part of the myth is the idea of egalitarian worship, which supposes that in the early church, everybody shared and there were no leaders. But again, the historical record flatly contradicts this. Clement of Rome, writing around AD 96, which is while the Apostle John was likely still alive, wrote explicitly about order in the church. He used Old Testament Levitical analogies to describe Christian worship leaders, emphasizing that worship must be done at the appointed times and hours and by the appointed ministers. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around AD 107, who was a disciple of the apostles, likely John again, was even more blunt. He said, "Let no one do anything properly belonging to the church without the bishop." For Ignatius, the validity of the Eucharist depended on the presence of the bishop or his appointee. So then, what did this worship actually look like? Well, it wasn't freeform jazz or impromptu slam poetry sessions. It was a fusion of the two Jewish pillars that the apostles had grown up with: The liturgy of the word from the synagogue, the reading of the law and the prophets, the chanting of psalms, and a sermon or a homily, and the liturgy of the faithful from the temple, the Eucharist. This was the early church, and their view of the Eucharist was a new sacrificial offering prophesied in Malachi 1:11. Even the Apostle Paul alludes to this structured tradition. In 1 Corinthians 11:23, when Paul says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you," he's reminding them of a liturgical formula. The words he uses, that they took bread, gave thanks, broke it, matched the Eucharistic prayers used in the early church. Paul received this tradition not just from a vision, but from the liturgical assembly of the apostles he joined. Justin Martyr in AD 150 gives us a very detailed outline of the Sunday worship that actually mirrors the structure of historic Christian liturgy that's even used today. It included readings from the apostles and prophets, a sermon or a homily by the president, intercessory prayers, the kiss of peace, presentation of the bread and wine, the Eucharistic prayer, and communion. So, no, it wasn't some free flowing kumbaya session. It was a structured, hierarchical, liturgical service that in some places has remained virtually unchanged for 2,000 years. The organic house church narrative is compelling because it appeals to our modern democratic sensibilities. We like the idea of a faith that is purely relational, flat in structure, spontaneous in expression. But we must not confuse our modern preferences with the realities of ancient history. The early church moved from the temple to the synagogue to the home by necessity, and they carried the reverence, structure, and order of the temple and synagogues with them into those homes. To dismantle the institutional church in the name of returning to the early church is to destroy the very vessel that the early Christians built in order to preserve the faith. Historically, the church has always been characterized by ordained leadership, dedicated sacred space wherever possible, and the ordered worship of God.